everyone just relax and take a breath. So, thank you, John, for the mood music to get it started. That was great. Well, we're going to have you perform at every lunch meeting. So thank you all so much for being here today. I'm very excited to have our panelists be here. Actually, I'm going to grab one of these. I know you all by your first names, and I want to make sure I get your names correct. So, I think you all know me, but for those of you who don't know me, and for those of you who are online joining us, my name is Adina Ishii, President of the League of Women Voters of Berkeley, Albany, Emeryville. Thank you. And the League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization of women and men who fight to make democracy work. We had a very, very busy election season. We had 11 candidate forums with about 45 candidates and over 1,200 attendees. So I'm very happy to be on the other side of the election. And I just wanted to say that we have some folks who were candidates in the office, candidates who are running for office in the audience right now, and I just want to thank you all who are here. Thank you so much for running. And there are also some folks who are newly elected that are here. And so I think that all of you should stand up, and I'd like to recognize you. If you could stand, we'll give you an applause. Stand up. Yeah, there we go. Thank you so much. You know, it's so important that we have many candidates running for office so that folks get a choice and they get an opportunity to pick who's representing them. So I'm really happy to have those folks with us today as well. And I think earlier we didn't get a chance to recognize the board. I think there are some board members. So Bonnie Bain, who is our program director, Bonnie friends our event today, and Lisa Mills is somewhere as well. She was handing programs on the way in, and Ruby McDonald is here, Prop 13 Reform Team Leader. Thank you. And Emily, who is our treasurer, unfortunately had to step out, but she was here a little bit earlier. So thank you all to the board members who have put a lot of work into the event. So today, why are we having this program, right? Well, housing, of course, is something that our community really cares about and something that we've been looking at a lot. We worked very hard, the league worked very hard to help pass measures O&P. As you can see, I brought some signs so we could celebrate the fact that O&P passed. So yeah, let's have a time for that. But there were also housing measures on the state ballot as well. 1 and 2 things that would affect it also include 5 and 10. 1 and 2 passed, 5 did not, and neither did 10. And so what we really wanted to do was, after the election, what happens now, right? Considering what passed and what didn't, how is that going to affect us? And kind of how did we sort of get here today? I think it's really important that we kind of look at this situation from multiple different angles. So we invited a panel of guests to come and speak. And what I want to do today, just so you all know, we're going to have them introduce themselves and the organizations that they're a part of. Some of them are part of multiple organizations that they can speak about. And then we're going to have some questions that we've set up for them to answer, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. So since pretty much all of you are league members, I trust that you will ask questions that are actually questions. So I think that will be fine for today as opposed to our usual cards. So I just want to start, just so you know, we have Sophia DeWitt at the end here. Yeah, she's coming from EBHO. Brad Wiblin is the Executive Vice President of Bridge Housing Corporation. Paula Laverde is the Commissioner for the Berkeley Rent Board. And also works at Centro Legal de la Raza, correct? No? No. Oh, I'm sorry. Leah had recommended that you come and speak with us, and Leah works for Centro Legal de la Raza. And then also we have Xavier Johnson, who does work for Centro Legal de la Raza, and who also is a Berkeley Housing Advisory Commission, or HAC, commissioner. Sierra Club. So multiple different things that he can bring to our conversation today. So what I'd like to do is start, if you don't mind, with Sophia, and we'll just work our way down this way. To just introduce yourself, how are you engaged with housing issues? What kind of things should we know about you and the work that you're doing to kind of help give us context for our conversation today? Can you reach that?
Yeah. Yes, everybody. I really encourage everybody to grab that mic and just put it like right next to your mouth so everybody can hear you.
All right, good morning, everyone.
What is that?
Or good afternoon.
It's my pet peeve.
Now it's probably better. Now you can hear me, right?
Yes. Yay.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Reverend Sophia DeWitt, and I serve as Program Director at East Bay Housing Organizations. And we do advocacy for increased affordable housing and policy that will help to incentivize and create new affordable housing across the East Bay, both Alameda and Contra Costa County. We are a membership organization. We have about 500 members, and our membership is diverse, so that includes individuals who care about the issues of affordable housing in the East Bay communities and want to be involved in advocacy, learning more about the issues, and also congregations of diverse faiths who also want to be engaged in advocacy around affordable housing policy that engage with us through an interfaith program, our Interfaith Communities United program. And then a lot of our members are nonprofit, mission-driven affordable housing developers. And then also we have a community organizing program that we run, our resident communities organizing program that works with residents of affordable housing properties in Oakland at this time. Our community organizing is confined to Oakland, but we do education, advocacy, community organizing, all in service of trying to increase affordable housing opportunities for the lowest income communities and communities of color here in the East Bay. So my work encompasses a lot of local policy advocacy with mayors and city councils. Currently, I help to convene our Berkeley committee and help lead our work here in Berkeley. I've also done and am doing work in Southern Alameda County, Fremont, Union City, Hayward, as well as beginning some work out in Walnut Creek. So that's a little bit of the work that I do and how we engage around the issues of affordable housing. And together with the League, we were big supporters and proponents of measures O and P here in Berkeley, and also we're out giving dozens of presentations throughout the community about O&P here in Berkeley, but also encouraging folks to vote positively on Propositions 1 and 2 to provide additional dollars to help build more affordable housing across the state.
Great.
So, thanks for inviting me here today.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming. And Brad is missing his daughter's volleyball game to be with us today, so thanks, Brad, for giving that up. Could you please just give us an introduction of yourself and the work that you do?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, some of you may see me at lunch, and I was sitting by myself looking at my phone. I wasn't playing a video game. I was, in fact, tracking the game. But University of San Diego has the match well in hand. In Santa Clara, you'll be happy to know. I know I am. She's a recent Berkeley High grad, so definitely a local product. Brad Wiblin with Bridge Housing. I'm a executive vice president. I serve on the company's senior leadership team. We just celebrated our 35th year in operations a couple weeks ago, had a big splashy event in the city and raised a bunch of money for the programs and services that we deliver in our buildings. And I have been at Bridge for 24 years, so I'm bucking that trend of people that don't stay in companies very long. I got out of grad school here at Cal and went to work for Don Turner, who founded the company back in the day, and have been with it ever since in a variety of roles. Spent 10 years in Southern California, opened our offices down there, kind of took our platform, our brand, our balance sheet into those markets. And then for the last 10 years, I've been here based in our San Francisco headquarters. Bridges occupies a kind of interesting place in the nonprofit development world. We are a production-oriented company. That's how we were founded, with the mission of quantity, quality, and affordability. Really simple. And ever since 1983, that's kind of been what we've been pushing for. We've become one of the largest companies doing this. And it just puts us in a different place. And I think as we get into policy discussion, my guess is you've got a diverse set of opinions here. Maybe not all of them will agree. And I want you to understand a little bit about where I'm coming from. We are on the front lines as a producer of housing, trying to convince neighbors that we're not going to tank their property values or there's test scores in their schools. And you can imagine, I mean, we even have people that oppose teacher housing, teachers for their school district. I'm sure they love their teachers, but they don't always maybe want them to live in their neighborhood. So it's pretty surprising what you see out there at the tip of the spear, as it were. And I'd be remiss if I didn't thank the league, because I've had the league on my side in San Diego and Marin, I think here in Berkeley as well. So thank you for being educated and helping educate a wider group of voters. We have a number of projects going here in the East Bay, and Berkeley Way is a project here in Berkeley that some of you may have heard of. It's had a little bit of a circuitous route. I thank Sophia earlier for coming and testifying on our behalf. We were in front of the council recently. We've been trying to build parking and replace what the parking is on that lot for the last year and a half. And as many of you know, construction costs have gone through the roof. So that parking went from costing $60,000 a stall to almost $100,000 a stall. There's a high water table, so they have to de-water and pump during operations. We're next to the BART tube, so there are structural considerations. So we were twisting ourselves into an infeasible project to try to replace the parking. And the council, to their credit, a month ago or so said, let's not build the parking, let's build the housing. And that project consists of a very complex and important building for the city of Berkeley. We're doing kind of a build-to-suit for Berkeley Food and Housing. They're one of the local nonprofits that does a lot of the heavy lifting with the homeless populations. There will be permanent supportive beds, there's an emergency shelter, there'll be veterans housing, they'll have their food production facility there. That's kind of a once in the lifetime of a city facility, and it's not inexpensive. So we'll be building that for Berkeley Food and Housing, and they will operate. And then right next door, we're building, as Bridge, we're building a 93 unit, kind of more traditional tax credit financed affordable housing project, serving kind of 30 to 60% of the median income folks. You may have seen some of our other work. We're operating at scale. MacArthur BART Station. After about 8 years, we managed to get 660 apartments entitled there, and that is going up and going gangbusters. The affordable housing component was the first piece that we built, and now there are some market rate pieces being built as well. That's a theme in our company. We do a lot of kind of transit-oriented development. We've got buildings at West Oakland, a couple modular buildings at the San Leandro BART Station. We're working on another building at Fruitvale right now. So anywhere there's a train, whether it's the San Diego trolley or in Seattle at their light rail stops or here in the Bay Area, that's really been our focus. We have a really nice little project at the El Cerrito del Norte station that's been approved unanimously by the council, and we're trying to cobble together the financing for that. It is difficult in Contra Costa County where they haven't voted for a bond measure. And we can talk about that a little bit. I think I used up my 5-minute intro. Thank you.
Thank you. Paula?
Yes, thank you very much for having me here.
Closer. Yeah, right in
Thank you very
There you
much.
go.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So, my name is Paula Laverde, and I'm a rent board commissioner. I was fortunate enough to be able to be reelected last week, so thank you very much. The rent board oversees rent control units in the city of Berkeley. Just a little bit, I'm going to give you some numbers about what the housing stock is like in Berkeley. So Berkeley has 49,565 housing units or stock buildings. Of those, half are rentals. So that comes out to like 26,000 units that are rental units. Of those 26,000 units, 74%, or about 19,576, are under rent control. 23%, about 6,600 units are not under rent control. So that's a lot of units under rent control, and a lot of units that are in the rental housing industry. So half of the city of Berkeley are rental units. So Berkeley, what the rent board does, and a little bit more, so 50% of those 19,576 units are owned by property owners who own 10 or more units. So 50% of the stock is owned by big corporations who make a lot of money off of rents. So what the rent board does is it provides a lot of outreach to tenants and property owners about their rights and responsibilities. The rent board does workshops to both, or seminars to both property owners and tenants. The majority of those workshops go to property owners to teach them about the law. And there's also counseling services that the rent board provides, over 1,000 every month, counseling services. And then also mediation services. And as a rent board commissioner, there's mediation services when there's a conflict. What the rent board does and the rent board commissioners do is when there's an appeal on one of these mediation decisions, and then we are the ones who decide if the board has applied the law correctly or not. So that's what we do as rent board commissioners. So, as you know, housing is a really big problem. Affordability crisis is a big problem in Berkeley and the rest of the Bay Area and beyond. So I'm looking very much forward to having a conversation about ideas and what we can do, what the future holds for having to deal with the affordability crisis that we're facing. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Xavier, will you finish us off for intros, please?
Sure. So, as sort of Medina mentioned, I'm kind of in a few different groups. So, Sierra Club, Berkeley Housing Advisory Commission, and then Centro is my day job. So I'll start with Centro because I think people are probably less familiar with the specific work of Centro. And so my role there is I'm basically a legal fellow, and I work actually with the Oakland Rent Adjustment Program, which is the equivalent of their rent stabilization board. So we actually we give legal advice to tenants. We provide them information on what their rights are. So if a notice is given to them, we tell them, is this a valid notice or is this not a valid notice? In addition to that, we also help them to prepare their petitions for the Open Rent Adjustment Program. So what that means is if they get a rent increase notice, we look at it and say, oh, this isn't valid, here's why, and then we help them provide the evidence and the materials that they need to dispute that with the Open Rent Adjustment Program. And then in addition to that, we'll help them provide the evidence, but then we'll also represent them before that commission as well too. And so what we see literally, we do clinics 3 days a week, sometimes 4 days a week. And so tenants, we get 10, 20, 30 tenants every single day at one of those clinics who come in with a rent notice, or they come in with a notice to just vacate the property altogether. And so I started there about in October, so I haven't been there very long. But already I see sort of the waves of people who are being directly impacted by the housing market. It's pretty much at this point the stage right before homelessness. And then with that, my previous job, which I was in for about 2 years, was with Congresswoman Barbara Lee. And so with that, I kind of saw a little bit different side of things. So on that side of it, I actually saw a lot of homeowners coming in because they were facing foreclosure from the banks. And it was kind of the same process, and I saw a lot of Wells Fargo over and over and over again. A lot of the time, with homes that had been owned in like East Oakland, different parts of the community, facing foreclosures. And so one of the weird things is at Centro, it's not that weird, but at Centro, they are all like tenants' rights attorneys. They've been doing it for forever. And so I'm kind of the lone person who like actually has this weird, like super intense sympathy for homeowners facing foreclosure too. They're not like not sympathetic to it, but there are people who worked in tenants' rights for like decades and decades. So they see the people come in and buy the homes after the foreclosure, and they have no sympathy in that situation. But a lot of that is sort of where my experience comes from, where that background comes from. I think it's worth mentioning too, I lived in Texas before California, and my job that I did at sort of the end of my time in Texas was actually working for a land use and real estate law firm. And so I didn't know what it was when I started working for them, but what I realized eventually is they're basically just lobbyists for property developers. And so I did the work, and then like at some point an election cycle came around, and I was like, oh, I support this candidate. And they were like, oh, we funded the entire like opposition campaign for that. And I was like, oh, that's awkward. So, like, and they were good people, I liked them, but I was like, maybe I should work for a place that has like politics that align with me. And so after that, I was like, you know what, I'm kind of leaving this whole world. But the experience was interesting, and like I know the strategies that they did and what was effective for them, and I still to this day add some perspective. I wasn't there that long, so it doesn't have that much, but it's still something that I definitely think about.
Yeah, gosh, well, thanks for sharing that. I think that's an interesting journey through housing from different perspectives. So, and thank you all so much again for being here. And Paula came in at the very last minute, so we really appreciate you coming and stepping up. I just want to give you all a couple things I've been thinking about this morning. One is that, we already had a moment of silence earlier for folks who had died in the fires that have been going on. And something that I've been thinking a lot about, because my mother is in Agora Hills, which is being surrounded by fire right now, is that we're losing houses. I mean, it said like 150 or something houses have burned, and I don't really know, how badly or what that means. I'm sure there's more than that, and so that's something that has been kind of on my mind today. Just thinking about, wow, we already have this massive housing shortage, and so we've got fires every single year that are burning down more houses. And so the other thing I wanted to put out there is that we are the Berkeley Albany Emeryville League, and so as you're giving your responses to these questions, if you can keep that in mind, because we've got folks who are from different cities, and I know you work in Oakland, and we've got folks who are a little more Berkeley focused, or Alameda, Contra Costa County, but just as you're speaking, if you can think about our audience. And then one more thing I just wanted to put out there, the one measure I didn't mention was Measure C, which Emeryville passed, which was an affordable housing bond back in June. And so that's something else that we can chat about a bit, even though it didn't just pass. We can talk about that as well. So the first question I have, and by the way, Bonnie Jane came up with these questions for us, so thank you to Bonnie for reaching out to all of you and for coming up with these questions. But the first question I have is for Sophia. And if you can tell us what California's Prop 1 and Prop 2 mean for EBHO and the community, and what does the passage of O and P mean for Berkeley? I know it's kind of like a large question, so maybe we'll start with Prop 1 and 2.
Sure. So Prop 1 and 2, I would say that they don't mean as much for EBHO directly. They really mean a whole lot for the state of California. And what they mean for the state of California is $6 billion in additional funding to support affordable housing development. Proposition 1, of course, is the $4 billion bond, $1 billion of which will go towards supporting veterans housing, and the other $3 billion will go towards support of housing for other folks that are having a difficult time in this housing market. Teachers, working families, seniors, people with disabilities, etc. And then $2 billion from Proposition 2 will be earmarked specifically for housing for individuals who have serious mental illness or who need other supportive services. And that's really, all of that money is critical. We know we have such a large need for affordable, decent, accessible housing in the state. So $6 billion that we didn't have last week is is really good. I mean, it's going to take a while for that to result in units out on the street, given the length of the development process, but that is going to make a significant difference. But the $2 million in for supportive housing is especially critical, because for that population, what you're talking about is often the segment of the population that is the lowest income, from 0 to 30% of the area median income. And so to build affordable and sustainable housing for that population takes the most subsidy. It's the hardest to finance. And so having the $2 million dedicated in that way is really, really significant, and is going to be really helpful in building housing for folks that are the most in need of it. So a really, really significant victory for affordable housing this past week here in California.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you. That's great news, and I really appreciate you giving us a great overview for folks, especially who may not quite remember all the numbers, because I know there was a lot to vote on this year. Might as well let's go all the way down. Let's continue talking about 1 and 2. Brad, how has this affected Bridge, and also has this affected or has this influenced your growth strategy at all?
So I'm just going to follow on. I mean, really 1 and 2 mean that the state is back into the housing business in a big way. We passed a couple bond measures over the years. Prop 1C a few years ago was a couple $2 billion, and that got used up relatively quickly. So this will replenish that funding. Prop 1 in particular, in addition to the $1 billion for veterans home ownership, $1.5 billion goes to the MHP program, which is really a gap loan fund with a very de minimis interest rate. There's $150 million for transit-oriented development projects, something that I have a feeling will be in line to pursue, along with our collegial nonprofits out there around the state. There's a bunch of money, $300 million for regional planning. That's something that all cities and counties, have to go through a process every 5 to 8 years. And with some new federal legislation, something called the Opportunity Zone, there's additional incentives to have private capital enter, I'll just call it disadvantaged neighborhoods. And so I think a combination of some of the things that are happening, that was one of the few positive things that came out of that tax bill, was, and it was little known and it's little understood at the moment, but I think that will be leveraged with some of the money we have here. There's $300 million for farm worker housing, and another $300 million of matching funds that will match local money. So imagine Prop O in Berkeley. Now we have money to match state funds and leverage. I had some of my friends that knew I was in this space, and we were having these Prop O and P debates over the last month, and they wanted to know how far this money was going to go. And I said, it's going to be leveraged, maybe 20% of Berkeley's money will be leveraged with 80% of other funds, state, federal, etc. So it's going to go a long way, and this is it's really unheard of in Berkeley. Frankly, historically, Berkeley's barely had enough money to maybe do a project a year or have a project in their pipeline. So this is going to help supercharge what I think the mayor wants to do, and conversations we've had, which is really a continuum. If you think about kind of the emergency shelter at one end, people that just need housing tonight, and go through permanent supportive housing, other service-enriched housing for people with mental illnesses or addictions or dual diagnoses. Most of the people that we're serving in that space need all those services. And then all the way into the kind of traditional affordable housing at up to 60% of the median income. So I think Berkeley can control its own destiny, and we can develop this continuum, because we talk about homeless, but it's not a homogenous thing. There's all different stripes of folks, and there are reasons for becoming homeless, for how long they've been homeless, what they need to kind of, stabilize their situation and get back into, society in the best way they can. A couple other things I just wanted to say that I think it's fascinating that Prop 2, that was originally Rob Reiner's measure that he pushed back in the day called the MHSA, Mental Health Services Act. And the state wanted to make that money more flexible. And when they put out some regs for that, the mental health advocates said, hey, that's mental health money. We're going to sue you over that. So they said, okay, we'll put it on the ballot. So that's why Prop 2 wound up on the ballot, so that money could have a more flexible audience. And as we've said, it's still going to be serving people that, for the most part, probably have mental health issues, but it's going to be broadened into more around homelessness. So I think that was a creative thing, and to the state's credit, they actually put out a NOFA for that funding about a month and a half ago in anticipation of this passing, because time is of the essence in all of these things. People are struggling today, this month, to make rent or find housing, and so as we talk about a little bit later, you're asking what do we think we need to do, and I'll presage that and say we need to expedite at every turn the delivery of these various housing types.
Yeah, I do think that that's something people are often concerned with. It's like, okay, we passed this, now what's gonna happen to it? Are we even gonna see this money for the next 10 years? Like, where is it gonna go to? And making sure that we are following this money and showing people that what they voted for was the right thing, I think is so important, because I think we're at a time where people are concerned about voting. Like, why should I support this? Is this even gonna help me or my community? And I think that we need to prove to people that when we pass a ballot measure that it's gonna do what it says it's gonna do. Paula, can you tell us a little bit about 1 and 2 from your perspective, and if you have any thoughts on it?
Well, I can add a little bit to what Brad said. Prop 1 will, for every $3 or for every $1, we'll get $3 for construction, which is huge. With O, the mayor told me that we'd get $4 for $1 we put in from A1 and Alameda. That was Alameda County voted that in 2016. Money's been being collected for the past 2 years. Now we have, with passage of Prop O, will allow us to tap into that money, and now Prop 1 will allow us to tap into that money. So it's really a win-win for everybody, because it shows that the public and the voters of California realize that we do have a crisis and something needs to be done, and they're willing to tax themselves and buy bonds to be able to get the work done, which is really important. And it's really exciting to see that, and that on this end of it, everyone is on the same page, because we do need to build affordable housing, because we don't have any affordable housing being built right now. So I'm very excited about that, very excited. Just to add a little bit, Prop 1 money will be used to build and renovate rental housing projects, which is important in Berkeley because we don't have a lot of land, but it means the city could buy up properties and renovate them and make them affordable. Also, I do have one number. The $450 million worth of this program for Prop 1 will allow for home ownership programs. So people, first-time home buyers, will be able to get low-income, to get funds for down payments, which is important. That if you want to buy a house, you can get a low down payment assistance, which is, the average cost of houses in Berkeley right now is $1.3 million, so it will add a little bit to that kitty. So I'm very excited. I just feel that there is hope in the future. And the people right now, the people of California, the people of Berkeley spoke that yes, we want to build housing and we want something done now, and so that's great.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm really looking forward to buying my first house. Xavier, can you add to that at all? And is there anything that 1 and 2 will do to affect the people you're serving, or if you have any other thoughts from your other positions?
I think the last comment you had could easily be a whole other panel in the future. So I think that what I'll do is I'll focus this actually on like the federal level of government right now, because I think that there's a little bit of an opportunity in a lot of different ways. And what I mean by that is, first of all, I think like Prop 1 and Prop 2 are amazing because they provide sources of funding. But I think one thing that is often not thought of or talked about is how the federal tax credit program kind of sets the standard for what we really can do with those resources to begin with. And so I think, like, for example, right when Trump won the presidency, one of the first things that ended up happening is just immediately all of the tax credits were devalued, just by the mere fact that Trump was going to set the budget. People were not as willing to make loans on the basis of tax credits because they knew they weren't going to get as much value for them. And so that like sounds super high level and like theoretically, like what does that even mean? So what that means is that like all of the resources that theoretically would be going to nonprofits to develop housing in the form of loans, there's just less money available overall. And so the reason I think we have a sort of an opportunity now is that, I guess legal nonpartisan, so we should be careful how I say this, but like, when you have a Congress that's willing to invest more money into tax credits or willing to provide more resources to fund that overall at the federal level, that means that what can be done at the local level is going to be expanded. And so what I think right now is now that there's been a little bit of a different conversation going on in Congress, now's the opportunity for us as community members to be organized around it and say like, okay, like this should be a legislative priority for us to move forward with. And I want to also highlight the idea that was mentioned, opportunity zones, which I think no one knows about ever. But that idea actually came from the Congressional Black Caucus, and it was intentional as a means of helping to uplift some of the communities that have historically been disadvantaged. Now, I think it's kind of like a I don't have the right metaphor for this, but it has a lot of potential and a lot of risk, I think, actually.
A dual-edged sword?
Yeah, but it's like, one of them's like a shield, and the other one's like one of them is, it could be good or it could be really bad. I feel like, no.
Besides the analogy.
Besides the analogy, yeah.
Moving on.
I think that what happens and what matters is when you have a community that has historically, like, it's a fine line between displacement and like economic opportunity growing. What matters is like, where is an economic opportunity growing and who is it growing with? Are the people who live there, are their economic outlooks going up because they've gotten increased resources because they've got better space? Or is it that wealthy people have just moved into the area and there's now services for them, but people who used to be there are just gone? And I think that how this plays in opportunity zones is that if we can, as a local community, define where those resources go and how they're utilized to benefit people who have like put time and effort and energy to the community, and at the same time being an open and welcoming place for those who are new and coming as well, I think that's what's going to define how those can be successful. But I do want to put that out there, that like it is a great opportunity, but also potentially risks some loss too.
Thank you for giving us that perspective. I appreciate that. It's good to have you come from different places. I'm going to start this one with Paula, actually. I mentioned O&P earlier, but let's talk about it now because I think that was a lot of things to talk about. But if you could tell us a little bit about what O&P will mean for you in the work that you do, and then we'll kind of do a little roundabout here.
Well, as a rent board commissioner representing the Rent Stabilization Board, it won't really do much because affordable housing it will be public subsidized housing, and those units will not come under rent control. So what we'll be seeing is, not only the need for more affordable housing, but what other housing will be built that is not under affordable housing. That's where our scope would look under if anything were to change and new housing units coming on, or new rental housing units coming on the market, and seeing when possibly they might be put under stabilization. So O&P for me is fabulous because I know we're going to get more building, but as a rent board commissioner, we won't be overseeing the rent of those unless at some point, like I said, we have an exemption and or a rolling exemption, and after maybe 20 years, those units might be the market rate units might come under stabilization.
I guess what I was thinking about was for Measure P. You might have some folks who could be assisted by some of the Measure P funding in terms of
for mental health, services. Well, it would most likely help people who may be losing their housing because they're having, living in distress and not being able to afford your rent can lead you to a lot of mental health problems. And the stress that we see. We've had a lot of people right now displaced as a result of of the possibility of Prop 10 passing, and we saw landlords raise rents astronomically because they could. And so a lot of people were displaced. Now, this money would most likely, very, very much likely, would help them maybe stay in their units, or be able possibly to help them find other units for housing.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
Let's keep moving, so we stay at least in the same order. Xavier, could you speak on measures O and P at all, and tell us if, I know that your work is in Oakland, but I know you do work in Berkeley, and if you could talk a little bit about what you think about those two measures passing.
Yeah, I think it's huge. I think that, we could solve the housing crisis if we had like $2 billion to just invest in the city of Berkeley, right? At least for the city of Berkeley, we could solve it. We could have enough units built that people would have spaces to live. You could like help people who are displaced in the construction units, but like the reality is that we don't. And so, just resources to help with building more units in the city of Berkeley is always going to be helpful. I'm kind of a contrarian, so I kind of think of like the flip side of it too, but at the same time, I just really think it's going to be overall so extremely beneficial that there's not a lot that can kind of go along with it. I don't.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah, I think also I want to add C in there too. I think in general, just people are excited about us building more affordable housing. It sounds like that's kind of the consensus. But Sophia, do you have anything you want to add to anything that's been said about O and P or C?
Sure. I mean, I'll just echo a little bit of what's been said in terms of the importance of the local dollars that particularly, let's talk specifically about O and then Measure C in Emeryville, that are dedicated dollars that are to go specifically and only for affordable housing development. Having those local dollars is really, really critical. As Brad referenced a little bit earlier, the city of Berkeley historically has not had much local funding resource to be able to support affordable housing development. Maybe they've been able to support like one project a year. Currently, the city of Berkeley has most of its housing funds, local housing funds tied up in the Berkeley Way project, which is a fantastic project. It's going to do wonderful things, but has made it hard for there to be much additional development beyond that. Before the passage of Measure O, the city of Berkeley had only about $4 million in its local housing trust fund, which may sound like a lot of money and is about this much money. So $135 million bond for affordable housing development is huge. I mean, obviously it's the biggest bond in the city of Berkeley, but I mean in the history of the city of Berkeley, but it will be able to, people have said, leverage other dollars even 5 and possibly 6 times. Basically what that means is when you're building a new affordable housing development, and Brad could speak to this much better than I, much more technical, but you need lots of different sources of funding. If you're going to build a 60-unit apartment affordable housing complex, $40 million is maybe somewhere in the range of the total amount that you might need, and it's probably going up as construction costs and land costs go up, right? So you need lots of different sources of funding. A lot of that comes from the low-income housing tax credit program, which was referenced before. And yes, indeed, when the new administration came in, the value of those tax credits started to go down pretty precipitously because people with higher incomes and investors were like, oh, this means that at some point in the near future, we won't have as much of a tax liability. We're not going to need to pay as much in taxes. So therefore, we don't need as much of a tax credit or a write-off on our tax obligations. So the value of those credits went down. That meant the federal government could do less, and there was less money available. but having the local money to put together with the tax credit money, with the county Measure A1 dollars that Alameda County voters and Berkeley voters passed in 2016, and taxes that Berkeley voters are already obviously paying. It makes projects in the city of Berkeley more competitive, because some of that A1 dollars Berkeley will get just by virtue of population. Some of those A1 dollars Berkeley has to compete for against other cities in Alameda County, and having a local match, being able to say the city can contribute this much, and together with the A1 dollars and with potential tax credits, it just makes development in Berkeley much more likely, and that's really important. And then of course, the Measure P dollars will help to provide really needed services to folks that are currently unsheltered, either through supportive housing or through just emergency services. So it's a very exciting thing.
I'm gonna just tag team on unless you
No,
want to get in.
No, go.
The first thing I would say is hang in there. You know, most of the people in this room that have gray hair like me probably own a home in Berkeley, and eventually you'll get there, no doubt.
Just as soon as you turn gray.
I don't think it's a requirement, but in my case, it kind of coincided. What I would say, what does it mean to me as a Berkeley homeowner? You know, I challenged my network of friends and colleagues in Berkeley to put their money where their mouth is and vote yes, because for those of you that did the math on your own house, whether your annual tax payment or should you choose to sell, it's real money. It's expensive, and most of us have been blessed because our houses, you know, have risen with this wider market, and we didn't do anything to achieve that. We just happen to live in a very desirable city, and so that was the conversation my wife and I were having, that, you know, let's pile some of that back in. It was easy for me as a 25-year housing advocate, so, but that's important, and as we heard, there's incredible support. Every elected official is now pro-housing, virtually everyone in the markets I'm in. San Diego, LA, Seattle, Portland, the Bay Area. Hasn't been this way, but housing has become really at kind of crisis proportions. And frankly, I think it's the visibility of the homeless that has gotten people to vote with their wallet. Nobody wants to come and open their shop and have to, you know, hose out the detritus from the night before, et cetera, and step over people on their way. So even people who aren't sympathetic to this issue want that problem to go away. They're willing to help pay for it. And I think that's the groundswell of support that we've seen. It's traditional people that are advocates for housing, and there's a whole bunch of people who see the problem and want to help solve it. I was going to touch on a couple of things. I think there's a whole great discussion that could happen around opportunity zones and the sort of risk of gentrification versus the opportunity of investment. A lot of these communities haven't had investment in many, 3 cycles that I've been working. We own 19 properties in opportunity zones. That's where we end up working most of the time, and it just so happened they dropped an opportunity zone designation on them. And it is going to help us leverage money to build more housing. And I think we look at these opportunity zones as our role in them as the people that help stem the tide of gentrification. We're building affordable housing so people who live there today, if they get priced out by, you know, rising property values or rising rents, we're providing long-term housing that, you know, working folks can afford. So I concur there's some challenges. Nobody knows exactly how it's going to play out, but I think our role, as we see it, is to be a bit of a bulwark in that setting and offset what could be some negative consequences.
Thank you. Yeah, so I've got 2 more prepared questions I really want to get to. I'm sure the audience has some questions, but I want to get through these because I think that they're important. I'm sure people will want to ask these anyway. I'm going to start with Xavier, and also I think you might have had some other thoughts that you wanted to add in earlier. Could you explain what the loss, the Prop 10 loss, will mean locally, and what you believe we need to see in state housing policy moving forward? That's our next question. I'm going to start with Xavier and then pop back over to Sophia. Go ahead.
Sure. So I will speak. This, I think, a large part comes from my experience in the Centro, but also working with tenants' rights activists for quite some time now. So for those of you who aren't familiar, Prop 10, one of the things it does is it would repeal Costa-Hawkins. And so what that means is it did a lot of different things, but one of the main ones was like vacancy decontrol. So once an apartment full of tenants is in place in a particular unit, once all those tenants leave, even though the unit may have been rent controlled before, they can raise the rent all the way up to whatever they want to, essentially, at that point. And so that's one avenue that can kind of keep our rent prices up really high right now, is that even if something is rent controlled in between the tenancies, it can go up really, really quickly, really, really fast. And also that mere fact kind of creates a perverse incentive for property owners to want to get rid of the tenants on a property. So what that means is that if they keep the rent controlled tenants, they have to stay paying that rent continuously, but if they get rid of them and get them out of the property in some way, shape, or form, whether it's harassment, whether it's just continuously trying to bother them, whether it's just making their life there kind of a nightmare, it gives property owners an incentive to do that. So that's one of the challenges that we see, is that you have some property owners out there that are just generally awful to their tenants for the sole purpose of getting rid of them so they can raise what the rent actually is. And so removing that by passing Prop 10 would have allowed one tool to prevent that from happening, because if they still would have to do another rent control tenant moving in, at least they'll probably find other loopholes and ways to get their profits out of it one way or another, but at least it wouldn't be around to that particular tenant being harassed and trying to kick out of the property too. Some of the other things is that for properties that are sort of new construction, it also prevents you from putting rent control on them as well. So, and the idea behind that was that we wanted to incentivize new development. Yeah, that was what the main premise of it was. But then what that ends up happening is then you have tenants who are in newer buildings that eventually just get massive rent increases. Sometimes we also will see tenants move into, that's the main thing, like, or if it's a unit that's like modified or substantially rehabilitated in some way, shape, or form, that can make it be basically new construction. And so that's another way that we see property owners try to increase their profits, is by changing the property so that it's suddenly a new construction or a substantial modification to it, and then allowing them to raise the rents whatever they want to. And that being said, like, there are challenges with that. I think that we want to incentivize building new homes because we do have a growing population. We want to provide resources for development, but we also want to protect the people that are currently housed and find ways to do both of those at the same time. And all Prop 10 would have done would have been to give cities the ability to make their own policies around rent control. And so we could have had local conversations about that. We could have discussed that as a city for like, what are the needs of our particular cities, but since it didn't pass, it kind of created an unfortunate space for that sort of conversation. And even with that, there are some things, so to the extent that there's space even within what exists right now to make some changes. So one of the things that was kind of cool that happened in Oakland is they passed in this last election cycle what was called Measure Y. And what that did is, for properties that had 2 units or 3 units, there was an exemption for them to rent control before, but because that rent control policy was in place before Costa-Hawkins was passed in like 1983, they actually were able to change their rent control laws to make adjustments for that. And that measure ended up passing, and so we actually had tenants who had come in. They had gotten 60-day notices saying that they had to leave this property in 60 days or else. And because Measure Y passed in Oakland, now they'll actually have just cause protections. The next fight is actually about rent control, because they don't have rent control protections yet unless Oakland changes the policy. But at least now they have just cause, and so people who got those 60-day notices will be able to stay indefinitely, unless something else changes to make them have the just cause protection. And I'll get to the other thing I was going to say later on.
Okay, yeah, because we want to move through this question fairly quickly since we've got more. Sophia.
Sure. So what does the failure of Prop 10 mean locally? Very simply, it means that low-income tenants and folks that are currently struggling to pay the rent in many places are going to continue to experience pain. And they're going to continue to experience rent increases, they're going to continue to experience evictions, they're going to continue to be priced out, displaced, and forced out of their communities and neighborhoods here in the Bay Area and across the state. That's very simply what it means. There are some cities here in the Bay Area, like Berkeley and Oakland, that have, and San Francisco, that have some forms of rent control that protect tenants to some degree, but many do not. In Concord, for example, just a few months ago, there was a 28-unit apartment complex where the landlord raised the rent by several $100s a month. Everyone who was basically a low-income tenant in that complex was forced to move out because of cost. And the landlord said, look, I'm doing this because I can, and I'm doing this because I want to get the rent as high as I possibly can in case Prop 10 passes. And Prop 10 not passing just means that kind of thing is going to continue to happen. All Prop 10 would have done is give local cities the opportunity to decide for themselves what local rent stabilization laws they wanted to pass. It wouldn't have required any new changes immediately in law, and it would have required a lot of advocacy from tenants to get new rent stabilization laws. EBHO supported Prop 10 and supported Measure Y in Oakland because we talked a lot about housing production here this afternoon, but EBHO understands that the solution to the housing issues that we're facing as a region and as a state is not just about production. We also need to preserve the affordable housing that currently exists in the private market, and there are some policy options that we'd like to see in relationship to that. And we also need to protect tenants right now from unjustified rent increases or evictions, help to stabilize neighborhoods, particularly for our lowest income residents and our communities of color that are most vulnerable.
Thanks. Sophia, Brad?
Prop 10 was divisive, and an inordinate amount of money was spent on both sides. I would have loved to have had that money spent on housing support, or production, or anything other than what it was spent on. For me, I think the biggest challenge was that it was sort of this binary, we heard all the arguments against it, worst case scenarios on one side and then the worst case scenarios on the other side. One of the things that was late coming to the conversation was a proposal that came out of UC Berkeley, the Turner Center, Carol Galante. Full disclosure, my former boss, someone I think the world of. But they had a proposal that was kind of a middle ground, and it didn't have a chance to get debated much because we went into full campaign mode on both sides of Prop 10. So maybe in the aftermath of this, maybe there is some policy measures that can happen. I think that proposal, and I'm sure there are plenty of room for disagreement on this panel and in this room, but it would cap what an annual rent increase could be. It was tied to CPI plus a couple percentage points so that you wouldn't hear the horror stories like in Concord. And I happened to be at a city council meeting when 22 of those families paraded in front of that council and told their stories. People lived there 20 years. And I can tell you if Prop 10 had passed, and this is not a knock on Concord, but I don't think Concord would have done anything as a result of that.
Probably right.
So I'm just saying that, as you said, it didn't require anything. It just opened the door for cities like Berkeley and other like-minded cities to implement some form of rent control or a more robust form in Berkeley's case. So I am working with some folks, and I would like, frankly, to bring both those sides together and find some middle ground, because I do think there's a disincentive to production. And I'm going on my own history here. I moved here in '93, Anybody remember what the housing stock in Berkeley looked like? Did you ever try to rent anything? There was disinvestment. The landlords were not painting their units, they weren't maintaining them, there was no new construction. For how many years in Berkeley? 20 years? So that I think that's real. It's a dampening, it has a dampening effect on investment. And I had a professor at Cal, a couple of land economists, world-renowned, Mike Tietz, David Dowell, and they gave all the arguments against rent control. We heard the other side as well, but my own experience trying to rent an apartment in rent-controlled Berkeley back in the day, it was pretty sad. I wouldn't want anybody living in substandard housing, and that's what was here. So there's some fighting words for my colleagues.
Paula, do you have any thoughts? And then I really do want to move on to our audience questions.
Well, yeah, so the loss of Prop 10 is a huge win for the rental housing industry. They spent $75 million, well worth spent for them, because it changed absolutely nothing. We still have Costa-Hawkins in place, and Costa-Hawkins is, a state law that benefits only one set of stakeholders, really. Developers, property owners, and investors, because tenants who don't live in Berkeley, in San Francisco, and Oakland, where they're rent controlled, tenants continue not having any protections. They still have unlimited rental increases they have to deal with. Single-family home renters in single-family homes have no protections. So it's a status quo. And you're right, the Turner Center did come up with some ideas. They came up with the anti-gouging idea, which one of the candidates for the Assembly 15th District talked about. And the Turner Center suggested that you should have rental increases below 10%. But their idea is 5% plus CPI. Okay, so the CPI, the rate of inflation that went up for the San Francisco, Oakland, San Jose Bay Area from June 2017 to June 2018 was 3.9%. Okay, plus 5%, you'd be seeing 9% rental increases. I'm a state employee. I do not get 5% pay increases. Still, they're proposing rental increases that are way above what people are earning. However, it is an idea. It is something to leverage with, and I agree with you. It is an idea to look at. I think personally that there is an expectation that developers or owners of property, that they need to make a 10% increase on their investment every year. I mean, it seems like that's the norm. Why? I'm not sure, but that seems to be the norm. The other issue that this whole conversation brought off to light was also Berkeley had Measure Q, which would say that we would have an exemption a limit on the exemption for unlimited rate increases. Measure Q said after 20 years, the exemption for rent control stops, and there's a stabilization on the rent of a building. And that's something we need to look at on a state level, I think. How is it that in Berkeley we have 35-year-old buildings that are charging market rate for units? I mean, that doesn't, and they can raise the rent as high as the market will bear. How is that? So we need some stabilization on our older building stock. So that's something that's going to be talked about. I want to work, as I'm a tenant, as a renter, I want to make sure that that voice is heard in whatever conversation is going to be going on in Sacramento. Because tenants outside of Berkeley, San Francisco, and Oakland, tenants in Concord, in San Leandro, they don't have a voice in Sacramento in Sacramento. And so we need to be, as a rent board commissioner, need to be making sure that the voice is heard, that renters are taken into consideration. Right now, it is, you're looking at profit, but what about the people who can't pay, the $300 or $400 rental increases a month? That's crazy. That just doesn't make any sense. So I look forward to working with our state leaders to make sure that that voice is heard and that is taken into consideration. Because it's an imbalance of power. It's you know, I know things are not fair, and you know, but there is an imbalance, and there has to be a little bit more for people who have to pay rent. Thank you.
Thank you. So I would like to take some questions from the audience, and I know we do want to make sure we have time to talk about like what are we planning on doing, what can we do next. But I think is there a question out here, Greg?
Yeah. So I have a question. It was a little self-congratulatory up there when you were talking about how you have funding now. But I'd like to ask about what your projects look like. What's the average unit size? What neighborhoods are they built in? Because it's nice to talk about housing, but where is it going to be built? Are you building in rich neighborhoods as well? Are they small 3 or 4 units? Because very likely they're 50-unit projects. So can you tell me about some of these new projects?
Are you directing that question at Brad?
At the affordable housing providers.
Okay, so at the affordable housing providers,
Like, what does it actually look like?
what does the housing look like that is going to be built? Who would like to take that?
That would be Brad.
I had the distinct impression that was directed at me. So, I would say that most of the affordable housing that's getting built ranges from, on the small end, 30, 40 units. You know, and there's a project under construction on San Pablo that Saha's building that might be 46 units. Maybe someone here knows exactly. Up to, you know, 100, 120 units. I would say that statewide, that's kind of the average tax credit finance projects. There's a lot of fixed costs. You have a tax attorney on your side, your investor has a tax attorney, and as I say, my company, you know, it's just as expensive and takes as long to build 30 units as it does to build 130. So as I said at the beginning, our company's perspective is we're heading toward the 130 range because we're about production. There's a range of bedroom types and sizes, from studios to 3 bedrooms. We are building in high-income neighborhoods. That has been a HUD policy for several years. We are also building in places where other people aren't building, and those happen to be, in some cases now, opportunity zones like West Oakland, where we have been in a 15-year effort to build on 29 acres. And we have brought market rate housing into that neighborhood by creating a large master plan. We built a couple of affordable housing projects, but we're also bringing in what in essence are first-time home buyer opportunities in a neighborhood where the private market didn't want to go. So I think I answered the question, but there's a range of sizes, there's a range of rents. But most of our work is in that, I would say, 30 to 60% AMI. Those are the people that we're serving. We could have a conversation about moderate income. We are doing some work with some school districts. Teachers make too much money to live in tax credit financed housing. And so pushing that up a little bit, where school districts have some surplus property, and I know there's a conversation here in Berkeley about this. So there's most of the money, most of the oxygen in the state and national right now is to serve the homeless population. But there is a growing policy debate at what's called the missing middle, entry-level folks. Back when the tax credit came into being in 1986, 60% of the median income, that was serving the old saw of nurses and firefighters and the like. Well, all of those professions make more money than that tax credit can help. So we're doing a little bit of that work. You know, within the company, it might be 5% of everything we're producing is attempting to work at that missing middle. And I think it's a fascinating thing to take surplus school district property, convert it into housing for teachers, and allow them to stay. The biggest, I mean, you guys heard this number, but last year, San Francisco Unified had to hire 600 teachers in the summer. Because young teachers come there, they're excited, they've got to commute from who knows where to get into the city, and after about 2 years, they say, I'm out, I can't take this.
Brad,
So,
I'm
sorry,
I'm going to cut you off, so I'm going to ask another question.
Give
Elisa,
me the hook.
Just, you use the acronym AMI. What does that stand for? What does that mean?
stands for Area Median Income.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I think I saw a hand down here somewhere. Sherry and then Esteem. Yeah.
Yeah.
And if you could tell us who the question is directed at.
Well, anybody who can answer this. The Chancellor of UC, Carol Christ, has made, you know, a big emphasis on student housing. And if you pass through the campus, you'll see that there's stuff going on all over the place. And she's even proposed a People's Park mixed, I guess, yes. And so is that having any impact on the fact now that students will be more likely, perhaps increasingly, to be housed on campus and then not competing necessarily for the rest of the rental housing stock?
Thank you. So how will more student housing in Berkeley affect our housing stock? And Xavier, I think you wanted to answer that question.
Yeah, I wanted to respond to it because I don't think I have a direct answer to it specifically, but one of the things that we did in the Congresswoman's office is she asked for HUD to make a report on displacement and gentrification, basically. Like, from a national level, what are some of the major impacts to it, or what's the major causes of it? And one thing that came up that was a little surprising, a little not surprising, that I think is tied into sort of what was just mentioned, and then the question that you asked, was that recent graduates from college end up basically moving to the communities that have historically been underinvested and underutilized and have marginalized communities. And that's because that's tends to be the only place they can afford to go to. And so, and then the types of things that they start looking at are kind of the first waves of gentrification, because college students, like, particularly our demographic of, like, our age range ends up liking living in urban areas as opposed to suburban areas. So it's been a trend of changing demographics in communities. And so to the extent that we're not creating a housing stock for that demographic, they're going to follow where the market makes sense for them, which is going to mean going to places where they're sort of changing the communities and changing the cultures there. So to tie that back into what your actual question was, which is, will that help? I think depending on how it's structured, that could help to preserve the impact of student demand onto our communities as a whole. I think that I don't necessarily like the idea of the master lease thing, but one thing that might happen is students cycle out of properties really quickly because they either graduate and they leave for summer sometimes, or they just change where they're renting. And that in and of itself, while you have cost of Hawkins, is going to mean that those rents are going to continuously cycle to go up because they're no longer part of the apartment unit. They can raise the rent whenever they want to. And I think that people who are working and a stable point in their lives are able to stay in a property much longer, and that in and of itself is going to keep the market a little bit lower. And so that's one way in which it can be beneficial, but
I think definitely it depends, but Paula.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that our state senator Nancy Skinner was able to get SB 35 passed, which is to incentivize construction for dorms and for student housing. Part of that bill is 20% of it has to be for low-income students. So there is incentive right now for more housing to be built at Berkeley and all the other areas, all the other towns that have universities, to be able to house our students. Berkeley just this past August opened a brand new dorm, 741 units. I can't remember the name, but so there is stuff going.
Blackwell.
Yeah, Blackwell. Yes, thank you very much. So there is some building going up, and there's now incentive to build more for students. So that's an exciting thing we can look up in the future to see that eventually there will be more housing for students here in Berkeley.
Thank you. And Brad, real quick, because
pile on. I do think that the university taking, responsibility for its students is a very positive thing. And I think the other impact it'll have, for those of you that follow the ZAB and all these projects that are coming, I think it'll mean that the private sector can focus more on housing for Berkeley residents and young professionals and others, and not be building into the student housing market itself. And I think that'll broaden the opportunities. When I decide to sell my house, I probably want to stay in Berkeley, but it's hard to downsize. There aren't many downsizing opportunities, and I probably have people in this room that are overhoused in their big house because where are you going to go? So maybe we'll see some of that emerge as UC takes care of its own students.
Thank you. And there was a question from Esteem, and then I asked us that if we can go slightly over, because I want to make sure we really do get to talk about what comes next, what do we do now. esteemed.
Yeah, how many, what's the rate at which company, family homes that are going on the market versus families purchasing family homes going on the market and then renting them out?
Question, since I feel like we haven't heard from you a little bit. Can you tell us, what do you think is the biggest challenge in the years to come in terms of housing, and what do you think that we should be doing on a local level in terms of policy?
Sure. I mean, I think that we've talked about this issue. I love the greased pig image. I think I'm gonna because we've talked about this issue and how many facets it has and how hard it is to corral this and really move towards greater justice. But I think we need to work from a variety of angles. So in terms of tenant protections, we Prop 10 just lost at the ballot, but I think we need to look at things like maybe statewide just cause for eviction protections, or things like from a statewide policy perspective, 1-for-1 replacement of affordable units. So if you're doing some new construction and you're losing affordable units, the developer needs to put in as many affordable units, if not a little bit more than have been lost. Some of those issues from a statewide policy perspective are currently being debated in the Bay Area through what's called the CASA process, which is the Committee to House the Bay Area, and it's a wide-ranging group of nonprofit and for-profit developers, tenant advocates, environmental folks, labor folks, trying to come to some larger regional compact about housing and development. And those conversations have been going on for more than a year now. But as we get closer to the end of the year, we're hopeful that something larger will come out that can then go to our state legislature for some passage and consideration. So we have a lot more work to do on tenant protections, as well as continuing to improve the policy environment locally for funding support through things like impact fees for new for-profit development that can go towards affordable housing development, or inclusionary housing policies that have just been reapproved by the state. For a while, it was not legal to do that because of court decisions. So a lot of ways that we need to work on this issue together to make some good progress.
Thank you. Brad?
I was in Cupertino recently, a couple months ago, but Apple was just moving into their new facility, 15,000 people. And the city of Cupertino, if any of you know, is this very suburban place, 50s ranch-style houses, and there were a lot of items on the agenda that would have built some new housing, and yet they couldn't see their way clear. They didn't understand that they were 15,000 new jobs showing up, and they weren't going to build any housing. We're really good at creating jobs. We're not very good at creating housing. So I want to be better at creating housing and protecting tenants and all these things. So I think the negative externalities of the job machine that the Bay Area has become, I want to see the tech companies take a role in helping solve some of that problem, and some of them are. I think they're participating in CASA, and Google and Facebook are doing some housing projects. I think that's a great beginning. The other big challenges that we face, almost everything we build is with union labor, or certainly paying prevailing wages. But if any of you have ever had a negotiation with, labor council, it is a difficult conversation. The most recent example here, the city of Santa Rosa had a measure on the ballot to propose a bond measure. I went up and spoke, and lots of other folks spoke. Labor wanted what they wanted, and the Santa Rosa City Council didn't want to encumber the ballot measure with what Labor wanted. So Labor turned around and fought it. So Santa Rosa, it went down in flames. Organized opposition like that is really hard to overcome. So I want a little more collaboration amongst the environmental community and labor and the development community, because at some level we're all wanting the same thing, but everybody's got their own special interest that we, and I'll admit mine, that we all fight for. But I think there's enough commonality, so maybe we can find that through regional efforts like CASA and other things.
I love that. Thank you. Collaboration, definitely. Paula?
Yes, no, we're going to need collaboration. I think the biggest challenge, in my opinion, is making sure that the little guy is heard. So in Sacramento, they're going to be looking at, I heard that the governor is going to be, the governor-elect is going to be making some decisions in the first 100 days of his administration. I just want to make sure, and I think that the biggest challenge, like I said, would be just leveling the playing ground for the customers who have to, who rent the service of housing. Like I mentioned earlier, that right now it's an uneven playing field. So I think that's the biggest challenge, is to really make sure that the little guy is heard. Costa-Hawkins was passed in 1995 through a legislative act. A lot of people were paying attention, and oops, now, rents are being doubled. Now my landlord's kicking me out because he now has this law that once, I move out, he has this vacancy, so he could double the rent. So all of this started happening, and then it just was an avalanche. It's an avalanche, and now we have huge displacement. We've seen the demographics of Berkeley change in the past 20 years. The demographics of Oakland are changing, and this wave is now moving further east. People are commuting hours to come in to work in the Bay Area because they can't find affordable housing. One thing that's interesting, we have in the past 5 or 6 years, we've seen this major increase in homelessness. No, it's not because all of a sudden we have a bunch more drug addicts or a bunch more people that are just crazy. No, so we have a bunch of people who just cannot afford to pay their rent. That's a fact. How many people do we have living in cars who have full-time jobs? They cannot afford to pay the rent. And somehow, fortunately, people are seeing that and they voted yes on 1P, they voted yes on 1 2. So fortunately, people are seeing that. And in the 5th largest economy in the world, we should not be having this. This is like being in Colombia, 20 years ago, seeing people, beggars on the street. I mean, it's like, how can this be happening in the United States? How can this be happening in California? So I really think that the biggest challenge is having the little guy heard, and when it comes to regulating this industry.
Thank you. And Xavier, final thoughts, challenge, some policy ideas on the local level?
Another big analogy, perhaps?
Yes, I like the big analogy.
I'm trying to find a way to fit that in there now. I think one of the things I thought was interesting is, if you look at the resources that funded the discussion around Prop 10 and where they came from, I think that's an important part of the conversation too. On the one hand, you looked at the opposition for Prop 10 and you would see that it's like the California Association of Realtors. That's their economic interest. The reason they care about it is because at the end of the day, it's theoretically going to reduce property values or the money you can generate from rental properties. And so they're super opposed to it and invest a ton of resources into it because it's going to hurt their bottom line. At the same time, on the same token, when we talk about working with marginalized communities, the NAACP was also opposed to Prop 10. The president of NAACP also then left the NAACP to get a contract working with the realtors doing messaging around Prop 10. So as a voter, when you see something like it's interesting to see how the business community works in California, particularly in the Bay Area, versus how it will work in Texas. In Texas, you can be open, you can be blunt, you can say this is going to hurt people who own properties and we're opposed to it for this reason. But in California, to reach like a Bay Area voter, you don't do that. You pull in someone who's a marginalized community member to have them say how this hurts them. And so I think that when we talk about what's going to hurt marginalized communities, it's more important to be focused on like, okay, what is the real story underneath all this? Like, is this person truly representing the interest, or are they maybe being used for a particular purpose in a particular context, in a particular space? And I think that here, more so than other places, the strategy that, and there's not necessarily a complete lack of truth to the claims that they're making. Like, I think that if you're, like, there's very likely a person who's a tenant out there who got a massive rent increase because someone had a loan from Wells Fargo on their home that was predatory in lending, and they like have to pay their mortgage, so they did have to do a massive rent increase because that's the loan that they got. And that loan may have come from like a loan officer who like just finally got this job at Wells Fargo giving loans because it's the only time that they've actually been able to like escape from the situation that they're in. Like there is a cycle of things that continues to go on that trickles down kind of just to negative economic harms. But I think that a savvy voter is capable of like looking at those things, seeing the conversations, and then looking for the broad coalitions. Because at the end of the day, when you see like there's one interest that's on this particular policy, but they haven't gotten coalitions from other groups, that's where you'll see something I think is more exploitative. Usually when there's broader coalitions, there's more perspectives heard in the conversation. When you look at people fighting for it, if you see a coalition that's really diverse, that probably means it's been thought through from a lot of different angles. And so don't just look out for one marginalized community, don't just look out for that one voice, but think about like how does this fit in the broader conversation. I think that's what I would have done.
Thank you.
Thanks, yeah, and I think that's a great point for us to end on as Legal Women Voters, is that, you know, we had a very busy election season, we had a lot of things to vote on, and it's easy to get lost in all the information and who's endorsing this and who's paying for it, and sometimes folks just use the league in our positions, and I think that that's valuable that they have that resource, but I do think it's so important for individuals to look at what's on their ballot and how they're going to be affected by it. And how it's going to affect their community as well. So I want to thank the panelists so much for being here today and speaking with us. We have a huge wealth of knowledge here, and I feel very lucky that we were able to have you all here. And thank you all for staying. I know that I let us go a little bit late, but I really appreciate you all being here. I also want to thank Bonnie again for helping to organize today and really coming up with questions. And getting all the panelists here, so thank you to Bonnie. Thank you all again for being here, and Christine for videotaping. Yeah, thank you for doing that for us. I really encourage you all, if you have not yet joined the League of Women Voters, please do join us. I invite all of you to join. As I mentioned earlier, we accept people regardless of gender, so we invite you all to join. And please feel free to take a cookie on your way out. We've got a lot of cookies left. All right, thanks everyone.
Thank you.